Kelly's Taboo Terrors presents Visceral Pleasure and Extreme Cinema 2. Since last year's event was a rousing success, I decided to continue on with this tradition of bringing together all women to discuss a favorite subgenre of mine, and that's extreme horror. I'm Kelly from the Spinsters of Horror, and not only do I write for our website and other publications, but my co-host Jessica and I have a monthly horror podcast called I Spit on Your Podcast. I curated Kelly's Taboo Terrors a few years ago as I found myself drifting more and more towards these disturbing, controversial, transgressive films. Big content and trigger warnings, folks. If you know anything about Kelly's Taboo Terrors, then I hope you know what you're getting into. But if you don't, well, I would like to remind you that there will be discussions of themes and movies that might be upsetting for some viewers. Topics such as sexual assault, violence, torture, necrophilia, and more will be mentioned. So viewers' dismemberment is strongly advised. On the last panel of this weekend's festivities, we're going to be talking about cinematic taboos, starting with, or at least today's panel is going to be on necrophilia. In the world of extreme cinema, there are many boundaries broken and taboos explored. In this series, we'll be discussing the variety of cinematic elements that make these films unique and disturbing. To start us off, our panelists will discuss the fetish of necrophilia and its portrayal in the films Necromantic 1 and 2, The Corpse of Anna Fritz, and Deadgirl. Ooh. So I'm going to start introducing my guests, starting with Dani. Dani is the former editor-in-chief of We Are Horror magazine. You can find them across an expanse of published books, panels, podcasts, Medium publication, Cinespeak, Dread Central, Gaily Dreadful, Uppercut Crit, and more. They will be a featured cast member in Mental Health and Horror, a documentary coming out this year, 2022. When they're not gardening, weightlifting, or writing, you can find them on Twitter. Our next guest is Lydia. Lydia is a horror author and bookworm living in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. Her debut novel, Nightface, was published in 2011, and her short stories have appeared in Postscripts to Darkness, Dark Moon Digest, For When the Veil Drops, Memento Mori, The Wicked Library, and her collected series, Pray Lied Eve. In her spare time, she updates the new release section of the Horror Writers Association website, co-hosts Dead Air podcast, and talks horror books on YouTube at Typical Books. Being a big fan of horror music, books, and film, anywhere there is blood, you will probably find her lurking in the corner. Hello to both of you. Sorry. Yes, thank you for joining us. And last, but definitely not least, is Zoe Rose Smith. Zoe is a film journalist and founder of Zobo with a Shotgun website, podcast, and YouTube channel. She is the founder and editor-in-chief of Ghouls Magazine, an online magazine focusing on horror through the female perspective. Her work has been featured in Daily Grindhouse, Tetra Video Films, Second Sight Films, Hear Us Scream, and more. Her specialty lies in anything extreme with a penchant for nasty, gory, and controversial films and books. Welcome, Zoe. And again, I am your host, Kelly. Okay, to get this started, I have a warm-up question before getting into these very interesting, very disturbing, generally upsetting films, some of them. So, cinematic taboo, necrophilia. Besides the obvious one that we all could easily think of why necrophilia is so taboo, let's go about the panelists, my guests here. Why do you think it's considered taboo? And I'm going to start with Zoe.
Oh, I wasn't expecting. I think it's probably one of the most taboos because I think there's almost like a morbid curiosity with it. I think that as humans, it's kind of like this odd relationship with life and death and sex as well, which obviously comes into the element of creation between life and death. I think when you bring necrophilia into the topic, you are looking at, how us as humans inherently, we're attracted to bodies. We're not necessarily always attracted to the way that someone is. Sometimes it is like a physical attraction a lot of the time. And I think when you look at necrophilia, for instance, it's that taboo of kind of like seeing that someone could be attracted to a body that was once a living thing that no longer is. I mean, when you look at serial killers, for instance, you'll often listen to the tale of how they did all these horrendous things to someone, and they obviously, murdered them. But often it's the element of what they did to the body after they murdered it that seems worse in a sense. I think the aspect of, we've all grown up and seen that, when someone dies, we pay our respects to the dead. You go to their grave. It is someone, a lost person, a lost soul. We mourn for them. So then thinking of necrophilia, this defilement of the body after death, almost seems in a way worse than the defilement of someone that's alive. And obviously that does not take away from the atrocities committed to those that are living beings, but it seems to be like almost the most disrespectful thing you could do to a person, and a dead person at that, is to defile them once they don't even know they're being defiled. It kind of goes past consent into this horrendous disrespect of humans, really.
Thank you. Lydia, why do you think necrophilia is a taboo?
There's so few really universal taboos, and getting outside of like small local taboos or religious taboos, there's a few that like are big and seem to be pretty universal, like incest and pedophilia, cannibalism, necrophilia. And a lot of the other ones are for the most part avoidable, but then you can think of instances where, incest, not necessarily in a pedophilic sense, but marrying somebody who is closely related to you. There are instances, especially in history, where that happened for sure. We all can think of many examples of that. Or you could probably think of examples of just close-knit communities that maybe have closer cousins, perhaps. I don't know. Love, true love, perhaps, could override that in some cases to a certain degree. Cannibalism, we can definitely think of some cases throughout human history where cannibalism happened, whether it's in a state of survivalism or warfare, and not modern warfare, because there's no real excuse for that. But it is, for the most part, avoidable as well, except in some circumstances. Pedophilia gets higher up on that scale of like a super taboo thing because it's completely avoidable and unnecessary. And then necrophilia, I think that someone would be hard pressed to convince me that there is a case where it is necessary and unavoidable, like really, because you're looking at other things where people may have some psychological disorders that can be treated to a certain extent or going unaddressed that have caused the other things to have happened. Outside of Cotard's delusion, there's not many things that could convince me or many other people that you needed to have sex with a corpse. So I think that it just flies in the face of many of our just human sensibilities, because you cannot convince me that you need to have sex with a corpse.
Love that. Yes. Dani, your thoughts?
Well, this is one of the most taboo subjects, but it also, my mind is always spinning at a mile a minute. So, one of the first things I thought of is obviously, yes, this is one of the most extreme taboos, but it's also one of the ones that we as humans soften in some ways to make palatable for certain types of horror, entertainment, so on and so forth. I mean, the zombie love interest genre, has skyrocketed in the past, I don't know, 5-10 years, that it's cute to have a zombie boyfriend or girlfriend. That it seems like as long as our loved one is shambling and alive, right? But I'm just like, well, so I always think about like, well, where is the line? You know what I mean? When we talk about necrophilia as this topic that in some ways we've kind of branded it as cute, but when you get to obviously the extreme ends, obviously the films are going to talk about today, there is a complete removal of consent, that obviously these corpses are not animated. Wink, wink. Maybe one is, or two, one or two. So it's very interesting that there is this line. And I think it's also something that was in my mind also when I thought about this necrophilia subject, that I wouldn't say it's necrophilia per se, but when an individual that we love passes away, that it is very cultural that, you know, let's say someone may say, well, before they pass away, I want a lock of their hair, you know, or I want, you know, some sentimental object from their body, you know, before they're interred in the ground. And I think it's very interesting that we have very kind of strict, concrete things that we're like, well, this is okay because, you know, it's inanimate, it's a piece of hair, it's their glasses, it's maybe someone might say, well, I want the ring off their finger or whatever, something, you know, obviously not in the extreme, but, you know, at the same time, there's these gray areas that we also need to think about. But when it comes to obviously horror film, right, we are going to get into the nitty gritty of just how disgusting, repulsive, and obviously the complete removal and lack of consent that a dead body just does not have, that the closer an individual is to death actually is like when that ticking clock starts to begin, that like as soon as like the will and testament is read, as soon as the person is in hospice, as soon as that person is, you know, on the last kind of beep of the EKG. I mean, it's just very interesting that the closer someone comes to death, the more hands off we like to be in certain ways. And I think it's really interesting that more people are opting now for natural burials, that people don't want to be pumped full of chemicals and kept preserved and alive looking. Like people just want to go naturally, just for themselves and for the earth. So there's all of these conversations in there that just are kind of constantly in my mortuary science part of my brain. So
I love that. So let's move into, because I guess technically there's 4 films, but I feel like Necromantic 1 and 2, there's some elements that are shared in that. So that's why I put them together. It's wonderful. Some of my favorite extreme horror films are Necromantic 1 and 2. So I feel like, to start us off, I personally feel like Necromantic 1 and 2 deals more with the actual fetish of necrophilia, sexual arousal, sexual attraction. There's sexuality based in these two films. The paraphilia, there's, you know, so this one I feel deals with like the eroticism of it, especially in the first one, and sexuality and female sexuality in the second one. So let's have Zoe start us off talking about Necromantic 1 and 2 in the realms of necrophilia with the wearing the shirt. And her and I have talked about these films a lot and share a lot of similar feelings, especially about Necromantic 2. So go for it, Zoe. Let's start us off.
Yeah, big fan of both films, obviously. Even have a necromantic tattoo, much to everyone's dismay. I mean, the first film for me, obviously, I think is a beautiful film. Whilst, I mean, Dani, you pick up on a really interesting point about kind of, you know, softening necrophilia. And I think, you know, if you look at the first film, I guess in a way it romanticizes necrophilia. But I like that aspect of it. It takes what is essentially a very, you know, disgusting and dirty kind of taboo and turns it into a I think it poses the question to the audience as whether or not you can really blame people for the fact that they perhaps have this sexual attraction to dead bodies. You know, it's often a similar conversation I've seen around like pedophilia, for instance. You know, are these people that would need mental help? Are they people that actually have an illness and are afflicted rather than taking a choice to, you know, be attracted to this? So I think Necromantic one, in a way, kind of like explores that. I think it is a really beautiful film in terms of, you know, the imagery that's portrayed in there. It looks at how we as humans can be both kind of like repulsed and yet attracted to something at the same time. You know, when you watch the love scene in Necromantic 1, with that, you know, that gorgeous soundtrack playing in the background that is very listenable on repeat when you're out and about. Such a good song. But when you watch that kind of scene of, you know, this love triangle between them, there is something erotic in it, but at the same time you are kind of going, oh, you know, with all the slime and the effects that they put into there. But I wouldn't say it's an instant turn off in a way, like, and I think that kind of makes you question your own, you know, your own kind of morality, your own sexuality. It's an interesting way to approach it. And then of course you have the second film, which is about, you know, female sexuality and liberation, finding your climax and your orgasm through whatever means that might mean, even if, you know, it means you prefer your boyfriend dead over alive. It's not obviously your most kind of typical way to tell a story, but I do love what Jörg Buttgereit did in terms of taking this female character, putting her on screen and saying, hey, actually, even females can have fucked up fetishes just like the rest of the characters you see in horror films, because, you know, we're so used to seeing on screen male characters defiling women's bodies and raping and committing necrophilia. You don't often see it the other way around. So I think it's so, you know, powerful to see a female character actually doing the same and having this journey into, you know, discovering that necrophilia is the way that she can finally reach her climax, whether you agree with that or not.
Yeah, absolutely. Lydia, first I want to say, Lydia, you came highly recommended by Dr. Amy Jane Vosper, an earlier panelist. She was like, oh, you're talking about necrophilia? You need to get Lydia on here. So please, I'm so happy to have a necrophilia expert on here. Enthusiast.
Everything I learned from Dr. Lee Meller, who is part of the Murder Was a Case podcast. And he also has a newer YouTube show with Mike Morford, who is famous for talking about the Zodiac case. But he co-authored a textbook called Understanding Necrophilia, which if I had university textbook money at the moment, I would definitely own a few copies, but I try and shill it to everybody I talk to, because understanding necrophilia as a textbook is very interesting if you're into what's the word, like forensic pathology. Anyhow, me and Amy had a very long conversation about necrophilia 1 and 2 over breakfast one morning, and that would be fine if it was just at her place or mine. But no, we were in a very public place and talking quite animatedly and loudly and excitedly about a dear film. And one of her friends at the time that was with us, we didn't realize, because we kind of got in the zone talking about necrophilia, and he was mortified. And other people could hear us, and we're kind of like, oh God. Yeah, it was all bad, except that we had a lot of fun talking about necrophilia. Yeah. But yeah, these films, I'm a bigger fan of the first one because it is so much more stark and dark, and I have a real affinity for their apartment and just that sort of edgy, sort of almost street level punk attitude that they exude, if it's not just poverty that looks so cool in this film. And the escapism of the lead character, Rob, I believe his name is.
Yeah.
And everything he does is like this escapist thing. And then this corpse enters her life, and his escapist things become peeled away. He loses his job. He's losing his girlfriend. Even the corpse on the wall isn't his anymore. He had been practicing necrophilia, and that's where it sort of falls away and into, thankfully, as you pointed out, so the women are the antagonists here, if you want to call it antagonists, because that sort of all falls apart too. But they are the necrophiles here in 1 and 2, and I was so pleased with part 2 that there's more than one, and there's this network of people that are into very dark things. And the second one sort of broadens all of that, instead of just this one messed up girl with her somewhat equally messed up boyfriend. But I really like the tender moments in the first one. I like some of the stills. Like, if you haven't watched Nekromantik at all and you're interested in the beauty we're talking about, just take a look at Google Images. I'm sure some will pop up of her gently laying with her lover, this corpse, which is very artfully done and in various stages of decay, from being a floater in a pond to being a dried out, desiccated, skeletal looking gross thing. But all of the time she spends is pretty tender, even when they're affixing like a phallus and stuff too, well, a makeshift phallus to this body. Like, even that is like tender moments, and I really enjoy it.
Right. Dani, Necromantic 1 and 2. Was this perhaps your first time viewing these movies? I should ask.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, and yes.
Excellent. Yes, love this.
Like, it had been quite a while since I had seen something that what list would it be on? The gorier, more macabre, more I don't know, grindhouse end of horror. So it had been a little bit, and I was just like, at first I was like, okay, let me just kind of settle in. What am I going to see? What am I going to experience? But I hate to say that I wasn't as jarred as I thought I was going to be, because all of the effects were practical. And I'm like a practical effects nerd from way back. So when I saw 87 and 91, I was like, oh, I'm in for a treat. Yeah. So first, like, that was the main thing. And maybe that was what kind of pulled me out a little bit, that kind of maybe removed me just a hair from some of the more visceral imagery that was going on in the film. But I thought it was very interesting that this film decided to go, like Lydia and Zoe mentioned, with the more desiccated, more what is the word I'm looking for? More I don't know, disintegrated version of a corpse. Like, it's, I think, the first film I think I could think of in a long time that I'd seen where that was the object of affection. Like, that was in this between state with like half flesh on the body and like half sluiced off. That, you know, usually we get a softening in a lot of horror films, that at least there's still skin on, you know? So like, I think with Necromantic 1 and 2, it was just really interesting that, you know, and also I think it's also important that maybe we talk about culturally, like 87, 91, like the fact that these films, you know, were German, you know, centered, that Germany and Europe and everything else had quite a history beyond like giallo films, like, let's say, like in the Italian market, that were really doing some hardcore, subversive, bloody, visceral, nasty, you know, taboo stuff in horror that was like getting kind of completely banned from a lot of places in the world. So I think it's very interesting that these films are in this very kind of precarious place. Like, so obviously Berlin Wall came down, like, was it 1991, I believe? Little side note, I was born in Frankfurt. Shout out to Germany. So I was born in 1990. So like, my sister was born in 87. I was born in 90. So it's just kind of funny how these films kind of fell into place. But anyway, I think it's also just interesting to look at maybe what culturally was going on. I know like mad cow disease was a whole entire thing that maybe also the directors were maybe contemplating, like the fact that, you know, there was this, you know, mass viral, you know, death, you know, transmissible illness that was going from, you know, animals to humans, that, you know, maybe that was a whole thing, you know, because obviously there were these elements in Necromantic 1 and 2 that had to deal with, you know, animals like being butchered and slaughtered, and, you know, the psychological effect it has on the characters. So I just think there's all of these really interesting kind of historical threads, taboo threads, and even just like place and everything else about, you know, a film like this, and, you know, Germany. And I don't know, it's just very interesting that in a post-World War Germany, that, you know, it was kind of like blow the lid off of, you know, horror in some ways that even the United States was just not touching, like, at all, like did not have these really like grotesque, you know, films, you know, that were being, you know, kind of undergrounded and everything like that. So I don't know, Necromantic, woo, what a trip.
I would say on that note to check out the rest of your Bootgerät, not German, and the rest of the there's 2 other films of, you know, exploring the human condition essentially. So Dani, you might be into them. No necrophilia there as far as I remember. So you might be interested in them. It's Der Todeskin and Schramm. So might want to check those ones out too.
Will do.
You know, as a quick note, looking up necrophilia and realizing and learning that there's, I think, 10 different types. There's categorizations of necrophilia, if folks are ever interested in learning more about that. But I grabbed some little tips from some research that I did, but generally looking at what a true necrophiliac is. And I feel like Monica and Betty are these true necrophiliacs. I feel like Rob, which is kind of like in for the ride, he's fine with it. He's encouraging it. But like the women are, like, I think Lydia said, like the women are the ones making this happen and exploring their sexuality in these 2 movies. So, you know, when Rob couldn't cut it, Betty's like, all right, Corpse and I are leaving. So just find that so fascinating. Yes, Lydia.
I'll have to add, they're predatory necrophiles in the biggest way, which isn't something that you see often. And you can think of any necrophiliac as a predator, sure, because it's rape, basically. But they are like active, proactive, out there, loud, proud necrophiles that are going after what they want, where Rob and many other men in other films as necrophiles and in real life are kind of passive, like, it's there, I'm here, this is happening.
Yes.
Where the girls here are kind of active. And a little tiny side note, I believe that Nekromantik is still banned, if Wikipedia hasn't been updated, in Ontario, Canada, and Nova Scotia, Canada still, which is crazy to me.
Oh, it's still banned here, but thankfully we can still buy it or stream it or whichever. So, but yeah, that's interesting. Thank you for bringing that up. Still banned here, of course. All right, let's move on to our next movie, which is called The Corpse of Anna Fritz, a movie that I really, really enjoyed. It's a Spanish film that is infuriating. And going into this movie and even into Deadgirl, I've written about this and I've researched some about those movies. But I didn't realize that I would be able to get out of necrophilia, the idea of rape culture, toxic masculinity, the power dynamics when it comes to necrophilia. And The Corpse of Anna Fritz is such a wild, gross movie. And not even the necrophilia aspect of it's gross. It's these men in these movies that really are, to me, the enemy and the villains here. But in a study, I read about a study where they took a sample of 34 genuine necrophiliacs and breaking it down to different categories, 68% of these 34 individuals were motivated by a desire for a non-resisting and non-rejecting partner. And so I will open up the floor for you folks to talk about The Corpse of Anna Fritz. Zoe.
Yeah, this movie was quite a lot, as is the one we're going to be talking about afterwards. I didn't particularly love this film. I think for me, that whilst it looks at necrophilia in some aspects, I found that it more fits into kind of that, that rape kind of type of film. Perhaps you could even call it, and I guess bit of spoiler alert, but I guess you could almost call it kind of like a rape revenge film in a way. Which, whilst I really enjoyed those films, I think the rape revenge films I enjoy is where there is more of the revenge than there is the rape. And I found like this was quite an endurance watch. I found it very difficult to just sit there and be compliant in watching a film like this, and it will go the same for Deadgirl when we speak about that in a moment. But as you kind of mentioned about like toxic masculinity, I think for me that was the biggest thing that came through in the Corpse of Anna Fritz, is this aspect of men feeling like because this body cannot have a say in what's happening to it, that in a way they almost kind of go, it's okay to do this because this, she cannot talk back to us. They take a sense of almost entitlement that they have access to this dead body. And what does it really matter to defile someone's dead body when they can't say no? Which is such an interesting topic, again, around consent, because, it goes back to what we see constantly in the news is like, well, if you can't say no, did you say no? And it's like, if you can't say anything, then it was already a no. You shouldn't go there. If there is no voice to be heard, then there is consent. It does not exist there. And I think when you look at a film like The Corpse of Anna Fritz, immediately you bring in that question of, clearly consent is not, it cannot even be a question here when a corpse cannot say yes or no. They are not complicit in this. They clearly don't want that because they can't. It's not a possibility. And similar to what you said earlier, Lydia, is like, there's never a need to do that to a body. Like there's no need. It shouldn't be a possibility whatsoever. And I think it's such an interesting film to look at how the men coerce one another into doing these things. And even in a group of men and having this toxic masculinity, if you're the person that says, no, actually, I do draw the line here, this is wrong, this goes against my morals and my beliefs, you are still within that kind of like, complicit group, you're still pulled into it. And that, that is a theme that goes through into many of these kinds of films. And then it goes into Deadgirl again. And yeah, I think this one, it's not a film like I really didn't want to rewatch this film, to be honest. Like I really was like, do I have to? I did rewatch and I was like, yeah, I'm not going to watch that again. I think it's just, I find it just really quite too close to the truth of the things that still are happening today to people, to men and women, and also, non-binary people, to anyone really. And so I just think it's like quite a hard film to get through.
Well, thank you for rewatching it for this panel. I also didn't want to revisit it, but I did. Lydia, Corpse of Anna Fritz.
I should have rewatched it because I do love this film. I've seen it a couple times and it is a hard watch. It really is. And I think it was very timely. It had it come out 10 years before, it would have been, some of that gut punch would have been lost, I think, or it would have been maybe opening doors for some conversations about consent. Perhaps, maybe it would have been a trendsetter, but coming out when it did, and even now, it really does speak to how would this person respond? Were they able to consent or not? Well, they won't, because it's rape, We get a glimpse of that. We get a glimpse of what a dead body would have to say about this. Maybe not in so many words, maybe with a little bit of stabbing, but they are angry. They are not happy about it. They did not consent. And I love that we get to hear from the corpse. It's something that doesn't happen. Now you could say this is a necrophilia movie. And I was having this conversation with Chris, my husband, and he said, well, it's necrophilia until it's not, right? So this movie does have a line, so to speak, in it, where it is definitely necrophilia till it's not. And we find out that our friend, the attendant Pau, had probably violated a corpse earlier. And it opens that idea of, are all corpses at risk? Should we take steps to keep our bodies safe after death? Which isn't a thing that you should really worry about, because it is a very, very, very small percentage, and maybe underreported, but still very small from what I understand, at the risk of being a victim of necrophilia after passing. And maybe there is a higher risk for somebody like Anna Fritz. And it has a really interesting thing to say about the bodies of celebrities, that their lives are owned so much by their fans and the public that after death, are they at even higher risk for something like this to happen? Because that's sort of what lends the attention to the corpse of Anna Fritz in this film, is her celebrity. So it just has so much to say socially, let alone on the topic of necrophilia, which it does have a lot to say. And it is a filthy idea. These are filthy gentlemen. I don't know why I say gentlemen, but they're filthy men. But it is a beautifully shot movie.
Yeah.
If someone wants a very beautiful movie with the same sort of ideas and a lot less gross and a lot less horrible people, there's a movie called Decay that sort of has a similar idea, but
DK?
it's an actual, just Decay.
Oh, okay. I'm gonna again rewatch all these panels and increase my to watch list. So thank you. You know what? I am glad that you like this movie. Like, I like it, but I don't like to rewatch it. It's kind of like this back and forth. I think that's the element of I get to see revenge that I get really excited about. Dani, The Corpse of Anna Fritz.
Yeah, this movie was, as mentioned, a very difficult watch, but it also was a difficult watch because it highlighted that there is an entire industry that is situated and predicated on voiceless, but the what am I trying to say? I don't know, the assets of a woman, perhaps. So the fact that there's an entire sex industry that's created out of sex dolls and sex robots, and every time that a robot is created, it's like 0.001% maybe male, but predominantly women as subservient and as a sexual object. And it was just chilling to watch all of these kind of different threads about just how our society is created to make, women just powerless objects, that the objectification of the body was the point. That it was very interesting and very telling that as soon as they saw her body, they didn't, I don't know, mourn her face or say like, oh, she was so beautiful, she was so pretty. They immediately went right, like, for her assets and touching, like, you know what I mean, her sexualized parts. I thought it was very interesting that there was a complete disconnect from her as an individual and just her just completely as a sex object. Seeing that scene, it gave me like horrific, like Kill Bill flashbacks. And it made me also think that there was a very horrific case here in the United States about a woman who was comatose, and she it was found that one of the staff of this facility had raped her while she had been unconscious for many years, and that she was pregnant. And obviously there was a big search, like, how in the world did this unconscious woman, trigger warning, I'm sorry everyone, trigger warning. Yeah. But this is a very specific problem that even when I talked about that line between life and death, that even our most vulnerable people in hospitals, that this happens a lot more than people are made aware of, that people who are in very vulnerable positions of unconsciousness, or even just the elderly, that are in very frail and compromised positions, that there is this very fine line of people that will, as I love that Lydia said, that they are predators, that they are looking for an individual to control, to utilize for their own, fetishistic, purposes. And it's all about domination. It literally does not matter about, as Zoe mentioned, race, age, gender. It does not matter. It's about the power, the control, and the domination part. And that was so difficult to watch play out. And when she actually opened her eyes, it it was the most, I mean, I was actually praying for it. I was like, please, I have a feeling, because I wanted to go into this spoiler free, just blind. I was like, oh my God, what if she's not deceased? And actually this happens a lot. Not as often as used to happen in prior burials, but it still does happen that some people are sometimes like inside the mortuary, right? Or in the sliding drawer, and they're like, oh, I'm just unconscious, right? So yeah. I mean, because I've thought about going into mortuary science, and I've really thought about the ethics of how we inter our dead and how we care for them, and the treatment that they receive upon their passing. And watching films like this, it is just very, very difficult to watch.
I love that you bring up a few times, Dani, this line of what is being considered being alive to what is dead. Is it like, are you alive when your heart's pumping your blood throughout your body? Is it just brain activity? Because you brought up the softening of necrophilia, our zombie lovers and whatnot, but also the age-old question of vampires.
Mm-hmm.
They're undead, but they're
right?
dead. Their heart does not beat. Their blood does not flow throughout their body.
Mm-hmm.
But we have fantasized and eroticized vampires for like 1,000 years. So are we almost all of us casual necrophiliacs? Like, are we just like dabbling with this? But where is this where is the line drawn, like you said, between like life and death, and where does that play out? And I think that is a great segue into the fourth film that we'll talk about, because it's Deadgirl. It is from 2008. This is our zombie assault. Are zombies alive? Is Deadgirl alive? Is she dead? She's animated, yet a zombie so dead? Does any of these aspects and concepts of consent like any more relevant? Is it less relevant? I find this so fascinating. I don't hate movies a lot, but I really don't like Deadgirl. I think it's interesting for these conversations, but I didn't rewatch it for this because this entire movie lives in here and I don't need to rewatch it. But going back to the same study where I said 68% of this sample of 34 genuine necrophiliacs, so again, 68% of those people were motivated by a desire for a non-resisting and non-rejecting partner. There's some maybe rejection. There's stuff happening with Deadgirl, but in that same study, 12% of those people were motivated by a desire to remedy low self-esteem by expressing power over a corpse. And bringing in the fact that these are teenage boys dealing with a lot of hormones, a lot of peer pressure, a lot of different things as you're growing up. Self-esteem, I thought that would be interesting to tie into this. So Deadgirl, I'll start with you, Zoe.
I mean, I rewatched this one again, and similar vibes to The Corpse of Anna Fritz. Very difficult to sit through. I mean, to me, Deadgirl and The Corpse of Anna Fritz are very, very similar films in terms of their plot, their makeup. Whether or not Deadgirl is a necrophilia film is difficult to say. Whether she's a zombie or not, I find that bit a little bit blurred lines. However, I don't think that necessarily matters when it comes to looking at the topic. I mean, just picking up on your point, what you were talking about there, Dani, Kelly, on, how do you ascertain whether a body is dead or alive? For me, these films are not even really about, where do we draw the line on being dead or alive, as you mentioned, Dani, about, you know, being comatose. Well, you're not dead, you are alive. However, you're in that state of, it comes down to me is, again, consent. You don't have the voice, you don't have a way, any means to kind of say, no, this is completely against my will, which again in Deadgirl is exactly what we see. You know, they think they can take advantage of this body immediately, similar again to what you mentioned, Dani, about going towards the assets of these teenage boys. I think within the first moment when they stumble upon her, JT, you know, pulls off and immediately the camera zooms in on her breasts. That's the immediate draw, is to her breasts, and you almost kind of forget that those breasts are attached to the rest of her body, are part of the human anatomy. It's not just sexualized. And I think we've grown up in a, you know, we're in a world where body parts have become so sexualized. You know, you think of like Instagram, the fact you can't have nipples on there, because it's like, oh, well, that's sexualized. No, it's a body part. It's also a body part that feeds a child. It's not necessarily sexualized. And I think, you know, films like this that look at the defilement of the body do focus on the fact that, you know, those that are putting that power, taking that power and wanting to do this are so focused on it being something they can take and that they can have, it being, again, objectification, which I think someone mentioned earlier, just taking what they want because it makes them feel like they're in power. I think, you know, the toxic masculinity portrayal in Deadgirl is very, very interesting, especially from the aspect of teenage boys, because, you know, growing up as a teenage boy, I think it depends, of course, you know, household, the way you're brought up. I think a lot of young men are now fortunate enough to have great influences in their life that are teaching them right from wrong, but we also have a lot of, you know, young men that are not being taught that way. And you see that this, you know, this thing that they think that they need to be a certain way, they need to have, you know, some kind of like masculine way about them, and the only way that they can do that is through having that power within them. And I think, you know, in Deadgirl you see that within the friendship group, is it's almost like a pack of wolves. You know, JT is the leader of them, and he kind of makes all of the other boys feel that if they don't also rape this girl that is chained down in, you know, this horrible basement, that they're less of a man, that they're, you know, a pussy or something like that. I think that's the word that's used at one point. And I think we see, I think he's called Ricky. He constantly goes, I don't want to do this. And it leads to violence. It leads to him feeling like he's small, like he's worth nothing, like he is this, you know, outsider of the group, that, and he wants to, you know, be part of the group. He wants to fit in with the others. And it becomes a thing in school that all of these boys, I mean, one of the other boys at one point, you know, he makes it quite obvious to a group of like jocks, I suppose, saying, we have our own slut, she's our sex slut, she's ours, we can do whatever we want. And it's that boastfulness of, I have this object and I have power of it and we can do what the fuck we want, that makes them feel, you know, like they're above everyone else. And I mean, again, I think it just goes back to the culture we're in today. I think it's such a real topic that still exists. So I think, you know, looking at it that way, it's, yeah, another really horrible film to watch. And obviously they, you know, then they look at taking potentially other girls and turning them into sex slaves, which just, yeah, it's a nasty film,
Haven't they learned from the first Deadgirl? Why do you want to try to make more? She gets out and shows her rage at her treatment, right? So as much, we can only speculate how much cognitive ability that Deadgirl has, unfortunately. But yeah, Lydia, Deadgirl. Whew.
Yes, I had rewatched this because it had been some time, and I disliked it. And when I had first watched it, quite a lot. but not for the same reasons as many people. And it may sound so horrible to be like, well, I was disappointed because I felt ripped off because I came here for a necrophilia movie and I got a zombie show. And okay, so it has necrophilic tones, and it starts out as a far more necrophilic tone. But imagine how much horrible this movie would be if it was not a zombie, if it was a mute person, or any other person, or someone who was restrained where they couldn't have a voice, because that's really what Deadgirl's missing. Perhaps some faculties, yeah, we're not aware of how much cognitive ability she has, like you said, but it would have been so much more angry making if it didn't have that fantastical, monstrous, supernatural quality of a zombie. It would have been probably way more banned and hated than it was. Although it does have its fans, because it does have something important to say, much like the Corpse of Anna Fritz, about consent, date rape, power, control, hormones running wild, all of those things that we've touched on. The boys in it are sort of like incongruent to me because they are misfits, but they're sort of jockish too, and these sort of attitudes aren't typically the ones found in the misfit crew. And they're very good looking, sort of, depending on your taste and all that. So it's just a little incongruent, as is the fact that they will put their dick in something that will bite it. So I don't know if there's like a cognitive breakdown with the men that watch this sort of film. It must be like any other unmanning scene where there's penis trauma. This must have some real impact as well as a horror movie. So it must be effective on many levels. And it does have that conversation, much like the other films that we've talked about consent, power, and control. I like the look of this film quite a lot. I don't like the soundtrack, but I like the look of it. And it is a different kind of corpse yet again. So we've gone from it's this nitty gritty, desiccated corpse that's passing into or passing out of a putrefaction. It's grotesque, skeletal, very gross, very rare that necrophiles get into this. Like Ted Bundy, maybe Green River Killer. That's sort of style that they had. And then we're into, with Corpse of Anna Fritz, very fresh, probably a lot more common as far as a victim of necrophile. And that's like bedsit killer territory, from what I understand. I can't remember his actual name. He was arrested not too long ago, but he may be violated over 100 corpses. They have no idea how many. And then we have this. This is almost like Jack Ketchum's The Woman, where it's a feral woman. If zombie is, if you can't, if you don't want to use zombie in this equation, and sort of make it a little more real, to get like the impact, the full impact of what these boys are doing to this person, not zombie, but person. And then it's a whole other feeling. So I really like to dissect it beyond what it is. And maybe it's unfair of me to be ascribing all of these more grand theories to this poor little movie that I didn't really like too much, but it is fun to watch and think about it in a more grand aspect. And on that continuum of, we have a very desiccated corpse, we have a very clean, warmish corpse, and now we have this kind of rotting thing that's not sexy at all and bites you. So yeah, very, very weird entry into it, but valid, definitely, because of the state of her body.
Great. Thank you, Dani. I'm going to assume this is another first time watch, and I'm so grateful that you didn't start watching these movies and say, you know what, I'm not going to do this panel. I don't want to talk about this. I don't want to watch any more of these damn movies.
The eye-opening thing about horror, I love the genre because it always is teaching me something new. It's always just peeling back the layers of things that I always knew were atrocious and abominable. And these films, I always love to just look at, what is the kind of social or historical or, just there's always just this deep underpinning of, societal something bubbling underneath. And I love that, that you brought up serial killers, as a matter of fact. Because when watching this film, I did think of that very aspect, that many serial killers have abducted women, have kept them chained, locked in some house or some basement, and whether they murder them or whether they keep them almost to the point that they are almost corpse-like, or keep their body on the premises as a memento, or take a piece of them, or keep their bodies on the premises. Like, we have multiple documented cases of this happening over and over and over again, of various men that kill women. And in particular, it's women that are sex workers, women that are supposedly disposable, that are unwanted, that may be drug users, and how that may overlap with sex work, and how, women are caught in these very precarious circumstances. And that is kind of precisely, where my mind went to, these very dark places where women can be abducted, where they can just be, passaged away in some dark corridor, and then we find out years later that oh, there's multiple women down here, or like, oh goodness, how did we not know the strange fragrance that was coming from that house? How did we not suspect that there was something untoward going on? But this film was very interesting, and even had that overlap with the Corpse of Anna Fritz for me, because I should have mentioned this in the Corpse of Anna Fritz, but there is just also that through line of women in North America and South America, and how women are in very vulnerable places, where in South America, it may be more due to gang violence, or maybe due to drug trafficking, and so on and so forth in North and South America. But the fact that women are in a very precarious place in South America, that they may disappear, that their bodies are sometimes used as warnings, that their bodies are violated and made a demonstration to the community. And I guess the silver lining ish is that in our time now, that so many of us are, just proactive, are taking the power back, are, whether it be marching or being physically, like ready to fight, because we know that we are in a very precarious position. And I shouldn't just say women, but even femme-identified people, and the the tiers of marginalization and how that goes. But it is particularly insidious that it's women, femme-identified, feminine, that there's this anti-femme umbrella to all of this violence that we've really must take into account. So the scene, for example, when they had hit her to once again silence her, right, to make her be quiet. Now she's making noise, she's not palatable now, so make her be quiet. And when her face, and actually, in my opinion, I think maybe it's probably the actor, but I think she did have a pretty face. So I thought it was very interesting that when they said, well, we don't want to look at that, we'll staple a picture that we've ripped out of a magazine of a woman to her face, so further violating her even more, like now that she is more of a sex doll, that now that she is even more of a sex robot, that these layers that just come up, and it's just very, very dark territory to go down on a Sunday afternoon.
It is. And thank you so much for, like I said, jumping into a lot of these movies for the first time. All right, we'll start wrapping things up, but one last question on my end, then we'll open up. I know we have a couple of questions from the audience, but any other films you folks would recommend if people want to explore the concept of necrophilia in film? Anything, any recommendations on your part? Zoe?
I have quite a few. I'm so sorry. A couple that I really like. One, I like a couple of them. Aftermath is a great one. There we go. Yeah.
I was like,
So,
I have it. Yes.
of course
It's going to
you
be
do.
my recommendation.
I find that one quite a difficult watch as well, but luckily it's quite short, so that is a great one. The other one I really enjoy this film is Headless, which
I only laugh because, like, I watched that like 10 years ago and I'm like, what is this? And I've never rewatched it. It's probably due for a rewatch if you're recommending it.
I really like it. I mean, there's a lot of heads getting fucked, but I watched it off the back of the film that came before that called Found, which is a much superior film, also based off a book by I think it's Todd Rigby, something like that, but that's about a serial killer who essentially fucks skulls, and Headless is a short film based on that. Then the other films I would probably mention are Murder Set Pieces, which is pretty nasty as a movie. Visitor Q, which is just, that film makes me sick. And then the final one that I think is probably one of the most disturbing short movies I have ever seen. It took me a long time to track it down. Is from like 1997, and it's just called Necro. It's about 10 minutes short. I can't remember where you're going to find it. I'll have a look and if anyone wants, but it is essentially just about a man kidnapping a woman and killing her whilst he rapes her, and then continuing to commit necrophilia. And I have honestly never seen anything that has made me feel so horrible inside before. It is one of the nastiest 10 minutes you will ever see. And yeah, I don't know if that's a recommendation or just a warning to never find it.
We'll take all of that. Sorry about the darkness of my now stream because I have a cat that turned off my light. So there's that. Lydia, any recommendations or cautionary tales?
Cautionary tales, like the time that I watched Aftermath on Netflix when Netflix was new, and I was like, "Oh, this looks good." Imagine that. There was a time when Netflix was cool, but yeah,
yeah, right.
As far as like some harder to find things, Inner Depravity Volume 1 and 2, Inner Depravity 1 specifically, is not that easy to find anymore. It had been online, and now you can get it as part of a DVD set that's equally hard to find called Art/Crime. And the reason it's contained within a documentary is Rémi Couture, the Montreal-based special effects artist who's worked on a lot of other stuff. Really fantastic guy too. He had created these films, and with lack of distribution, underground being what it is, he'd put them online with a very, very clear warning about what they were and that it was fiction. Yet somebody stumbled upon them, called Interpol. He was arrested for publishing a crime comic under our criminal code here, which is it was under the obscenity laws. Went through a horrible $30,000 court case that cost taxpayers millions for them to find him not guilty of such an offense, because it is in fact art. But it was very similar to the Charlie Sheen incident that we were talking, or that you were talking about earlier today on a panel.
Yeah.
But yeah, so Inner Depravity, really hard to find. Maybe you can find it. I don't know. I haven't looked for it for a long time, but yeah, Inner Depravity. Decay, as I had mentioned, totally other spectrum, because Inner Depravity is very grotesque. It's very violent. It's a serial killer violating bodies. Decay, on the other hand, is two girls break into a house that belongs to a very isolated gentleman who takes care of orchids, and necrophile style fun ensues. There's no sexual assault that I can recall from that movie, though. It is very tender. So if you like the tender moments in Nekromantic, then you will like the tender moments here in Decay. And I want to put in another vote for Headless. It's interesting that you could watch Found to a certain point when the young boys in the movie Found find the movie Headless and watch it, and you could pause Found and watch Headless and get that full effect, and then continue watching Found.
Yeah, yep.
That would be
Full immersive
intense.
experience.
It really would be. And there's more that come to mind, but a book specifically, Dead Inside by Chandler Morrison. It puts a lot of what we've talked about here to shame in its violence, its violence against corpses and the unconsenting. And it takes it to different levels in the printed book. I think that you couldn't quite go in film without being arrested. So very, very, very violent and very grotesque, very, very grotesque stuff in a book. And Header by Edward Lee, which is a underground kind of B movie that has some notoriety amongst people that read splatterpunk and horror fiction. That is sort of like a hillbilly horror kind of thing, rural horror with head raping. Mm-hmm.
There we go. Common theme. Dani maybe doesn't have recommendations, but
I think the only one I'm going to be the softie, but I'm maybe going to go with one that maybe if you watched The Corpse of Anna Fritz, maybe you can watch The Autopsy of Jane Doe as a supplemental if you're talking about a actual deceased woman who is on screen for the majority of the film that is clearly dead, but at the same time she has more agency and power than is led on at first glance. So I'm just going to spoil that actually she's a witch, right? And that underneath her skin is all of these incantations, all of these different markings and everything else that, you know, woe befell anyone, right? That defiles her body, that desecrates it, so on and so forth. I loved it. And I was like, wow, okay, I did not know the film was going in this direction, and I completely loved it. And I'd be curious if some would potentially call it a rape film, a rape revenge, only because obviously when you autopsy a body, obviously you do have to get scalpels and bone saws and different things that are going to crack the body open and everything else, fillet the body, if you will. So I'm sure somebody could make a good case for it, but I think The Autopsy of Jane Doe is a great, I don't know, cousin maybe to necrophilia, maybe. I'm not sure. Maybe only because we are talking about an unalive individual, but is she unalive? So I don't know. It's layers. Because
I would say that I would definitely throw it in because there's this one, it was just like a very brief scene, mention. It's like I think it's the son that says to the father, is like, are there any signs of a sexual assault? And the father's like, no, but swab her anyways. And you're like, okay. Right. It's just like this little thing that's put in there. So I think that, yes, it's maybe less necrophilia, but definitely the aspect of consent and agency. Good recommendation. And so let's open it up to if we have any questions. I think there are a few. Is necrophilia if they're just in love with the body, or does sex have to be involved? I'll say that there are, I think, 10 to 12 different categorizations of necrophilia. Then within that, there's other ones like active, passive, predatory, non-predatory. I think, Lydia, how about you answer this question?
I would be delighted.
I knew you would.
I'm no expert, right? You know, but yeah. No, there doesn't need to be sex for it to be considered a necrophilic act, because there is, of course, like injustices to a corpse. I forget what the actual charge is, which is really the only charge you have for necrophilia, because necrophilia is not a crime necessarily, or an illness. It's not really a mental illness diagnosable. I think it's getting close to that. I don't think there's anything in the DSM-V 5 or 6 about necrophilia as a diagnosable illness, but there are the debate is out. You say, well, Ed Gein never had necrophilic sex with his corpses, but he was surrounded by corpses and women and women's parts, and looking at them as their assets, that Dani pointed out. Like the sex object is there. They don't need to be actually copulating with it for it to be a sexual act. They could actually be having sex with themselves, with the corpse nearby, and it's part of that. There can be something that's not identifiable as a body that is left over from the act of serial killing or other found bodies, perhaps. I don't know how necrophiles really work, but they are into these things that aren't even identifiable as human. So they can't even actually have sexual contact with it. But there is perhaps an emotional bond. It's a control bond. Perhaps it's a scent thing. Like, there's so many variables when it comes to necrophilia that it's really hard to answer. Do they love these corpses? Some of them, yeah, for sure. And then you have Jeffrey Dahmer's, much like we're talking about the Deadgirl scenario, when somebody wants like a slave. That's exactly what he wanted. And he was victimizing young men, and specifically gay men. And it was like really that side of the Jeff Dahmer story is the most sad, I think. Was there love there? Like, so warped, perhaps. But no, maybe there doesn't have to be. It depends on what kind of necrophile you're dealing with.
Yep. Next question, which Jess has thrown up here from Amy Glamour Ghoul. Have you talked to other people who have watched these films? What were their reactions, and did they relate them to sexuality? Dani, how about you? Have you what did people say when you're like, I'm going to go on this panel and watch all 4 of these movies about necrophilia?
Oh, well, to my parents, I said nothing. Nothing. But no, actually, I'd be very curious if in the horror community, because I see, obviously we have our greatest hits in the horror, community, as far as films that we love, I think maybe the cutoff maybe is Martyrs for some people, as far as like, someone being in this betwixt and between, state of live being unalive, body being that, morbidly presented. Maybe it's just something we maybe need to be more open about as horror fans, that we have seen these movies, and that, I don't know, what did they bring forth? Maybe we just need to start writing about them a lot more, because I would honestly love, thank you, Lydia, thank you, Zoe, I would actually love to see more dialogue about the extreme ends of the horror genre that we watch. And it seems like we watch and then we like shelve it, we put it on the bookcase and we like, kind of close the door on it and never want to revisit it. But we've brought up so much about the impact that these movies are really having, these moral, kind of morality tales that are on the very underpinnings of these films, that maybe would be a great endeavor for a new, I don't know, horror writer or horror director, maybe, if we're talking about films, to try and, venture down to make something new in the 2020s. And what would that film have to say, especially because what we brought up about the objectification, about women being disappeared, about, women being, used as, for sexual slavery. I mean, there's all of these different things that in horror film, like, that we see the little bits and nuggets of. So like one of the first, like when we were young, I think we've all seen Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Who was at the table of the, at the head of the table of all the proceedings? The deceased mother's corpse, right? The mother's corpse is like right there, like they did not bury mom. She was right there. And the fact that, Leatherface, wore his mother's things, and like there's this, right? Like it's there. So it's in our horror films, and whether or not, we're ready to unpack them in that way, I think, I don't know, it's a discussion we've got to have because it's there.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And love seeing a little bit more tricklings of folks writing about these films. And I've tried to throw my hand in there. It's been a while, but I hope to get back to it at some point. I don't know if Jess wants to pop on for a second for this, but I know that she's been really intrigued by some of the films I've talked about or wrote about. And like I've shown her I actually showed her Necromantic 2 first, because I felt like out of those two, that she might appreciate it because it looks more like a regular film, it has maybe a little bit more money, had a little bit bigger of a budget, and just the Monica element of it. I felt like she could maybe not necessarily relate to it, but at least appreciate what it was trying to say, as opposed to Necromantic 1. Eventually, we did watch that one together, but, you know, people, the more you talk about these movies and put kind of the feelers out there, people get intrigued. There is that morbid curiosity, right? That they was like, okay, well, maybe I'll read the Wikipedia synopsis about it. Okay, well, now I mean, sometimes our imagination is going to be worse than what you're going to see. And I know that, again, I keep speaking for Jess, but she is like, really, I know her imagination runs wild. And then I show her Necromantic. She's like, oh, that wasn't as bad as I thought it would be. And I was like, I'm not going to show you a Serbian film, don't worry. But like, you know, there's thresholds and gradients, right, for that. Are there any other questions? I think Jess she was looking at some questions and started some questions. Here we go. Do any of you find that these films don't live up to the hype? Is there one that pushes the boundaries far enough or too hard for any of you? I'm going to assume films as in the films that we talked about today or in general. But I would say, why don't we go with the second question, which is there a movie that pushes the boundaries far enough or too far for any of you? Zoe?
I mean, my boundaries are quite far gone at this point, unfortunately. I am trying to rein them back in, and I do have to say that as I've gotten older, I have kind of gone, do you know what, I'm not as young and wild as, you know, trying to force myself to watch the most grotesque and nastiest things in the world. I have mentioned a couple of films on a couple of previous panels that have kind of pushed my boundaries for me. I think anything that has like real things in, I find quite difficult to watch. So for instance, obviously there's in Nekromantic, there is some real animal cruelty, which I know, Kelly, we've spoken about is like kind of like a hard no for you. There's a lot of other films for me, like I mentioned before, Orozco the Embalmer, seeing like real dead bodies kind of like embalmed, whilst a natural phenomenon that happens every day, something I personally just cannot deal with. And then one other film that actually really pushed my boundary, and I just kind of felt like it didn't I wasn't gaining anything out of it, was Marion Dora's Melancholy de Engel. There's a couple of scenes in that where there's like abuse towards a disabled woman, and you know, I used to work in care for a long time, and so seeing that scene, for me, I was just kind of like, do you know what, like I will watch a lot of stuff, I've watched a lot of horrible things, but it just felt really exploitative in the way that it was presented. It didn't feel like it was done as part of filmmaking. It felt like there was no real kind of like actual care for the fact that that could be like quite a triggering and horrible thing to see on screen. Whereas I think a lot of other directors are quite smart in their filmmaking, that they will show something, you know, like I think Mez Archie's I Spit on Your Grave is a perfect example of that. Yes, it is an exploitative film, yet when I watch it, I don't feel like it's exploiting the people in that film, and you know, women, and you know, victims of rape and things like that. I feel like they do it with some you know, level of respect to people that could it be triggering to. Whereas that scene in Melancholy de Engel was, I was just like, do you know what, I don't need to watch this, I can turn it off and have a good day. So that is exactly what I did.
Fair. Lydia?
Yeah, as I'd said, Deadgirl, did not live up to hype for me, mostly because I had expected something different going into it. I want to say hello to the question asker, Wes Dead Air Knight from Dead Air Podcast, my podcast co-host partner. Hey, and yeah, sometimes these movies are, you go into it expecting something, and much like somebody going into watching Necromantic for the first time, having the idea of what Necromantic is going to be built up in their mind and approaching it with like, oh, that's not so bad. Then on the other hand, you could approach some of these more visceral movies thinking you're going to be treated with something that treats it with kid gloves. A lot of the time, necrophilia in films that aren't about necrophilia just have a little scene, much like a scene that's not going to have a sex scene in it, where they sort of look at one another and then the lights go out and you know what happened. So when there's like a corpse on the table and someone gives it a look and the lights go out, you got an idea of what happened. So if you're expecting that going into some of the more visceral films that we've talked about, or some that we've suggested here, or some that have totally turned us off, then it could be really, really brutal. So it depends on the person. Personally, I've not been completely turned off by film, but I have subjected myself to some pretty intense cue sexy music, the glamour ghoul says. I know, right? But I haven't really had been completely like hitting a wall with these movies, or have bitten off more than I can chew, so to speak. Luckily, but because I am seeking this out, I would feel very bad for the person who stumbles upon a very rough necrophilia movie without knowing what they were going to get.
Right. Are you folks okay if I stop there? I definitely want to respect your time. We've gone over 20 minutes. I want to start wrapping it up, Dani, if that's okay with everybody. Okay, cool. Okay. Great. Thank you, everyone, for watching and joining us today. And our panelists, of course. Oh, you brought the goods, as always. I love all of you. You all continue to inspire me. But before we go, I have an announcement, the last official announcement of the weekend. But also, Zoe and I essentially have an announcement. So, Our Bloody Obsession. So launching next month with the launch episode is going to be a brand new podcast, Our Bloody Obsession, created by myself and panelist Zoe Smith. The Queen of Extreme meets Kelly's Taboo Terrors in a gorecast featuring all kinds of disturbing films. We're watching and talking about everything, folks. There will be no type of film unwatched. So it's a show created by two women whose bloody obsession is with all things nasty. So stay tuned for the launch episode coming soon. But we're on social media. Follow us at Our Bloody Pod or Our Bloody Obsession. And that's it, folks. The weekend is over. Woo! What an incredible weekend of extreme films and extreme discussions. So thank you all to my incredible guests today, earlier, all weekend. Your insight and work continues to inspire me personally and everyone around you. So thank you. And of course, thank you to Jess behind the scenes for all the technical work. Really, this probably wouldn't have happened without her. I need her. So thank you all again. We'll see you next year for Visceral Pleasure and Extreme Cinema 3. Stay grim.